Hi, welcome to Board Gems. In this video series, I like to introduce to you an older board game that's not really talked about much anymore, usually, but sometimes there are new versions of the game that come out, and so it's worthwhile revisiting the game and to tell you whether it's a gem or not. The game I'm talking about this time originally came out in, I think, 2008, 2009, and it's based on an older board game called Samurai, which I have covered. That came out in 1998 from Hans and Glück. This one is called Samurai the Card Game, and this is a joint production between Rio Grande and Abacus in Germany for like a co-production of an English-German edition. And there were a few Knizia games that came out around this time. There was a reprint of Medici as well from those companies, but also Raw the Dice Game, which is a game that I covered. And they were all in this sort of format, Carcassonne sized. So this keeps the general scoring of the board game and the general gameplay of trying to surround things, but it moves everything to cards. Obviously would draw many comparisons to the original board game, and I don't think when it came out those comparisons were particularly positive, because the board game it still is respected, but there's just so many more board games in the world right now, and Samurai is not always in print, so there's probably a lot of hobbyists who don't even know about the board game. Certainly, I would say that most hobbyists who were in the hobby in 2008, 2009 were familiar with the board game of Samurai. And this probably, to them, didn't quite hold up. Old classic kind of Reiner Knizia game that kind of got forgotten about until Allplay brought it back as Pollen. So, I mean, they wouldn't have the rights to Samurai the board game, so they couldn't use a Samurai name. But again, the Samurai name is probably not as recognized in the hobby now. So, fine to retheme it. And of course, has a nature theme, which is really hot right now with art from Beth Sobel. The game is for 2 to 4 players. This one says ages 12 and up, which is an exaggeration. This one, I think, said 11 and up. I go with 10, honestly. This one says it takes about an hour to play. Maybe in a 4-player game, yeah, it takes a while, an hour, even maybe a little bit more. This one says about 40 minutes, I think. 40 minutes is probably reasonable even for a 2-player game, but the game can go longer. And this is a nicely shrunk down version, not just in box size, but also, and more importantly, in the table space that it takes up. Let me show you how this plays. I'll use this newer version. Then afterwards, let's talk about why it may or may not still be a gem today. To set up the game, take these cardboard tiles. They show 1 to 3 insects on them. So beetles, bees, and butterflies. Here they are here, beetles, butterflies, and bees. You're going to mix these up in the bag. Put one in the middle to start, and then we're going to have one on deck. That's the one that everybody knows is going to be coming up next. The rest stay in the bag. Each player gets a deck of cards of a single color. So you'll see there's 4 different colors. It is a 2 to 4 player game. You're going to place the tokens of the insects on the side. In a 2-player game, you're going to remove some tokens. And in a 4-player game, each player is going to remove a couple of their cards. Check the rule book for that. In a 3-player game, you use everything. All decks of cards are the same, and they show one of 3 different types of bugs on the corners. So you see here's bees, here's beetles, here's butterflies. And a little image is shown in the middle as well. Each of these range in values. There's cards in here for 2, 3, and 4 of each of the 3 different types of bugs. There are also stars, which are wilds. And these range in value of 1, 2, and 3. Each player gets their deck of cards and shuffles them up and draws a hand of 5. And you're ready to begin. Overall, the goal of the game is to get these tokens. Each player is going to be collecting beetles and butterflies and bees. In order to be a winner of the game, you have to have more of one type than any other player. So we check and see who has the most beetles. If one player has the most beetles, not tied with anyone, then that player might win. We do it again for the butterflies and again for the bees. So there could be up to 3 potential winners, 3 finalists. If there's a tie, then neither tied player, that doesn't count for either player. You have to have a clear plurality of butterflies or beetles or bees in order to be considered for the win. If you can get a plurality in 2 of them, more than any other player, you win outright. Otherwise, you have to be a finalist, be the leader in one of these 3 types, then all those finalists total up the other types of bugs that they have. So the finalist that has the most bees, they don't count their bees in the final equation. Instead, they count the remaining ones, how many butterflies and beetles they've collected. That's their score. The player who collected the most beetles will count their remaining butterflies and bees, and that's their score. Highest score wins. How do you collect these tokens? By surrounding these tokens. These cards get placed around the tokens. This card counts as 2 influence in bees to any of the tokens that are here. This is a single beetle. These bees don't help get that beetle, but they will help to get this bee. When a cardboard token is surrounded, we check and see who has the most of each type shown on the token. Stars counting as all the types. So in this case, let's check the 3 different types. First, bees. There are 3 orange bees. There are 2 pink bees, but look, there's also 3 stars, which are wilds. So those count for all 3. So, actually, pink has 5 bees to orange's 3. Pink would get a bee token. We look at the beetles. There's 4 beetles by green, 3 stars, which are wild, so these count as 3 beetles for pink. 4 versus 3, green would get the beetle token. And finally, butterfly. No players have butterfly tokens, but these wilds count as butterflies, so pink with 3 butterflies would get the butterfly token. And then if you want, you can take this cardboard token and flip it face down, so you're not distracted by it anymore. I usually don't bother. That's how you get these pieces. So you're trying to surround these in order to have the most of particular types, so you collect the tokens. On your turn, it's very simple. You take one of your 5 cards in hand and place it adjacent to a token such that there's going to be a grid of these cards. If any tokens are surrounded, you evaluate, see who wins what bugs, and then at the end, draw back up to 5. The game will end at the latest when all the players have used up all their cards, but the game can also end early if all of one type of token is claimed. So how do more tokens get on the board? Well, whenever there's an empty spot that is adjacent to 2 different players, it is immediately filled with a token. What orange may do is place some beetles here because they see what token is on deck. So they may go for beetles here. Now this empty space is adjacent to 2 different player cards, 2 cards or more from at least 2 different players. That's important. If it looked like this, no token would go here yet, because that's only 1 player that it's adjacent to. It has to have at least 2 players adjacent to it, and then the token comes in. So this token would automatically go here, and as you can see, orange has a head start on the beetles. Whenever you bring a token out, you replace it, so there's always one on deck. You can always see what the next token is. This one has 2 bugs, butterfly and beetle. In the situation in which more than 1 empty space is created at the same time, bring more tokens on deck. So in this case, pink is going, pink places this token here. We evaluate this. Now, as you can see, 2 empty spots should get tokens. There's only 1 on deck. So what happens in this case is you draw an extra token, and then pink, the player who created these 2 spots, gets to choose which goes where. Their choice. And then, as usual, draw a replacement to have on deck. The game continues like this, creating a grid of cards, trying to surround these with the most of particular types of bugs on their cards in order to claim these tokens, and the game ends either when all players have played all their cards, or all of one type of token is claimed. And then we evaluate for each of the 3 types of bugs, what player has the most. That player is a finalist. If there's a tie, then neither of the tied players are going to be a finalist for that bug. The scoring is a little confusing, so let's have an example. So let's say by the end of the game, these are the pieces that players have collected. So we each look at the different types of bugs. Who has the most bees? Pink has 4, orange has 3, green has 3. So pink has the most bees, pink is a finalist. If pink were to lead in either of the other 2, so 2 of the 3, they would win immediately. Who has the most butterflies? 2, 4, 3. Orange has the most butterflies, so orange is a finalist. Now beetles. 2, 3, 3. It's a tie, which means no player is a finalist for the beetles. You can think of it as which player does these bugs prefer. The bees prefer pink, the butterflies prefer orange, but the beetles, they like orange and green equally. And because of that, we don't count the beetles for determining who the finalists are. There's no finalist for the beetles, so green, even though green has quite a bit of tokens, green cannot win. So now we look and see how many pieces of the other types do players have. So pink does not look at their bees. Instead, they count their remaining pieces. Their score is 4. Orange does not count their butterflies. Count the remaining pieces. Orange has 6. 6 to 4, orange is the winner. If there was a tie, then you look at the total number of pieces collected, and the player of the tied players who has the most total pieces wins. In this case, that would be orange. That's it. You're ready to play Pollen. So Samurai the card game came out 2009. This is a full 10 years after the board game came out. With the board game was, of course, super popular or super famous in the hobby. Very, very well respected game. I've covered it on the channel before. Now, when this game came out as Samurai the card game, it would, of course, draw comparisons to its older brother. And there was a sense, why would I play this if I could just play regular Samurai? I mean, it might be a little bit shorter, maybe, but not dramatically so. And actually, with the cards as large as they are, it actually takes up more space than the board game. But obviously, if you name something after a more famous version of the thing, you can't help but draw comparisons, and those comparisons don't really do the card game many favors. So it is nice to see a new version from Allplay, and the fact that it's rethemed, reset, and doesn't have anything directly connected to it, visually or thematically, to the original board game, means that it can kind of stand on its own merits. Now, of course, I know its past. There are people who are going to be coming into Pollen, they don't know its history, and they're going to evaluate it on its own merits. I almost can't help but compare it to the board game just because I know its history. Compared to the board game, it feels more casual. Now, it can be thinky as well, especially if you card count, which is very possible in this game. At the very least, you want to count your own cards so you know what cards are coming out later, because you will draw most, if not all, of your cards, depending on how the game ends. But you can even count the other players' cards. In practice, I only really, try to remember, Sarah played their 4 Bs already. And you can see, because it's on the table, it's not really counting, like memorizing. It's like you can see that's being played, but just making a mental note. It feels a lot more casual. I don't know a lot of people are going to be bothering to do that, but it is possible. 4 people, say, getting together, they've played Pollen a ton, there's that extra level that they can appreciate the game at. But I think the average hobbyist even, much less the average person, is not going to approach Pollen that way. They're going to approach it as a casual game. And it does lend itself to being a little bit more casual than the board game, only because the board game has a little bit of special things going on. Like there are a couple of special tiles, right? There's a tile that you get that allows you to switch 2 pieces on the board. That sort of thing could have been done in Pollen, moving 2 tokens with the insects on them and switching them. But they didn't do that. And I, for one, am glad about that. The fewer kind of rules exceptions, like some of those special things that the board game has, are going to make it stand out and add a bit of flavor for a hobbyist. But each one of those things will add just a little bit of extra rules complexity. Nothing for a hobbyist to worry about, but it's enough to kind of elevate it past casual play. My only point is that because Pollen doesn't have that, it skews toward a more casual play experience, more so than the older board game Samurai. The original card game really leaned toward its pedigree of being based on the board game. Its presentation, and its presentation is based on the board game, that the abstract tokens you're collecting are even more abstracted into just simple shapes. But it does lean on that theming a bit, that familiarity, that if you've played Samurai and if you're familiar with the board game's scoring, well, it's the exact same scoring in the card game. People nowadays aren't that familiar, or not as many hobbyists or casual players as might be interested in an all-play game, wouldn't be familiar with the board game. And so the scoring and the other aspects have to be able to stand on their own in terms of the theming and the setting. So does it? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And I've talked about this before. Like, I love Allplay's presentations. I love their small boxes. And in general, I love the fact that their rule books are short. And I've said this before on the channel. The longer a rules explanation is, the longer a rule book is, the more complicated the game seems. And so people look at it and they see this big rule book and it's like, I don't want to learn that. And so I really appreciate Allplay's approach of keeping the rule book as straightforward and simple as possible. It does mean, though, that the scoring, which is weird, doesn't have any thematic connection. They don't try to make any thematic connection to help you understand why the scoring is the way it is. Now, in my defense, or their defense, I guess, I don't even remember if the original Samurai board game had an explanation thematically as to how the scoring worked, but at least I was able to make one up in my head, right? There are voting blocks, you have to get certain voting blocks to pick a potential leader, and then the winner is the player who is nominated by one voting block who has the most support of the other voting blocks. I've explained it that way and had a lot of success. It makes sense when phrased a certain way. There's no phrasing like that in Pollen, and it wouldn't make any sense anyway, because the insects aren't nominating anyone. But they keep the rules simple, which I appreciate. Yes, that scoring is a little bit strange to people who aren't familiar with the board game. For some people, it's just, hey, that's Reiner Knizia for you, coming up with some wacky scoring thing, and then you could just move on. If you're not familiar with the board game, it is a unique scoring system. But it's also a scoring system that can be a little hard to play towards. I especially find this in the two-player game. Because in general, you're trying to get a lot of these pieces. You're trying to get a lot of the butterflies and bees. The more you get, the better. You want to be the leader in at least one, but you still want to collect a lot. You want to collect a lot of everything else. And in the case of a tie, you still want a lot of the thing you got the most in, because that's a tiebreaker. In a 4-player game, say, you can aim that a little bit. I need to be first in something. I see the 3 other players are each, that one's got a lead on bees, that one has a lot of butterflies, this player seems to be going for beetles, and I need to kind of pick a lane and try to see what I can get, right? Or, I seem to have a lot of beetles right now. I need to make sure other players don't collect so many beetles just so that I can make sure that I'm number one. You can do that a little bit better in a 4-player game, or even a 3-player game. Of course, it's a little bit easier to say, each player has one, basically. But in a 2-player game, I found that gameplay tended to kind of devolve into just try to get as many pieces as possible, right? You're going to be first in something, probably. And then, of course, it's whoever has the most pieces of everything else. So in general, just try to get everything if you can. But one nice thing is the game doesn't take up that much space as a 2-player game. In a 3-player game and a 4, in the 4-player, you don't play with all the cards. So 3 and 4 player is going to still be sizable, but not, the four player is not going to be, you know, a third as large as a 3-player game, but it takes up a lot of space. So I actually do like this as a 2-player game. Pollen is much, much better that way compared to Samurai the card game. In Samurai the card game, the pieces that you were trying to win were also cards, square cards. So the grid that ended up being formed was much larger. Allplay did a great job of making sure it took up a smaller footprint on the table by changing one of the types of cards, the ones with the show the scoring tokens you win, into smaller tokens that just fit in the corners of the other cards. Even still, the cards in Pollen are quite large. They're large square cards, and the information is only in the corners. In the middle is just taken up by art, you know, flowers and insects. They could have gone further in making sure that the game didn't take up as much table space as it ended up doing by just making the cards smaller. Still have the information on the corners the same size, but just shrinking it to remove some of the middle artwork, which is unnecessary in the game. Having said that, I feel like one of the main selling points of Pollen is the presentation, is the artwork from Beth Sobel. You know, there's a very interesting debate that it comes up once in a while, and it came up again recently on Board Game Geek, which is why I'm thinking of it. You have the idea of evaluating a game based on its presentation versus how it plays. I don't know if it's like a hobbyist generational thing, you know, somebody who's been in the hobby as long as I have. We appreciate presentation, but our acceptance level of like how bad a presentation we accept, our acceptance is much higher. And nowadays, we are all spoiled for choice because there are so many games out there that have just amazing presentations. The question comes up, would you rather have an okay game with a great presentation, or would you prefer to have a great playing game with an average presentation? And for me, and I'm guessing for a lot of you because you watch this channel, the latter is the way to go. The important thing is how the game plays, and the presentation just has to meet some bare minimum threshold to be considered acceptable. And, you know, there are bad presentations that we won't accept, but the bare minimum is pretty low, and we can accept that, and we can focus on the gameplay. And there are probably a lot of hobbyists out there for which that's the reversed. Why would I waste my time playing a game that has just an average presentation when I could play a game which is as good but has an amazing presentation? And what I have to say about that is, but they're not the same game. A person who makes that argument is assuming that you could play either game and you would be just as happy with either one from a gameplay point of view. So why not play the one with a better presentation? But in practice, they're not going to be exactly the same gameplay, are they? You're not getting the exact same game and then choosing which presentation you want. That's very rare. You know, some companies will do that, like Plan B has 2 different versions of, you know, the Century games, where you can get them with the historical kind of real-world setting, or you can have a fantastical kind of nature golem setting. But that's rare. Usually, a game is what it is, and the publisher will choose how to present it. And then you have to accept that or not. But if you want that gameplay, you're going to have to accept that presentation. The reason I bring all this up is because there are people out there who think like they just want to know, like what I said about the presentation being at least a bare minimum of acceptable. And then what the important thing is how the game plays. That's the important thing. But presentation, it just needs to be this good and I'm happy. And there are others for which that's the opposite. They want the most amazing presentation possible. And after that, well, they want the game to be good, but it only has to be a bare minimum of good for them to be happy with the gameplay. And the important thing beyond that is just how amazing it looks. If you're like that, or if you know somebody that is like that and you're buying a gift for them, Pollen is actually a really good choice. The gameplay isn't bad at all, but it doesn't really stand out either. But it meets that minimum threshold. It is a Reiner Knizia game. Guy knows what he's doing. The gameplay is solid. The gameplay alone is not enough to justify owning it, in my opinion. You know what? Presentation does matter. It doesn't matter as much to me personally, but it matters to a lot of people. Pollen is a great game to play in that setting, in which you want to play an OG, those old school German style games. They're interactive, they're played on a shared surface, they don't have really complicated rules, but they can be thinky, you can strategize, but it has that updated presentation that people want and expect nowadays. It's actually, and my wife pointed this out, at least visually, it looks a lot like another game I covered a long time ago called Gardens of the Alhambra. That also has square, well, they're octagonal, but it's the same thing. You're making a grid of these tiles, and in the corners between the tiles are the things you're scoring. Gardens of the Alhambra has much simpler and straightforward scoring. That game, I know a lot of hobbyists complain about it being quite swingy. It doesn't bother me. It can be a swingy game for sure. So if you want a game that looks nice and also has a little bit more of I guess you can have a little bit more confidence in the gameplay being solid because it's a Reiner Knizia game and he's got a pedigree, right? Gardens of the Alhambra is a Durkheim game, and I love Durkheim. One of my favorite games, The Rose King, is from him, and I love a lot of his games, and I like Gardens of the Alhambra too. Unfortunately, to my eyes, he's not as well respected as Reiner Knizia, unfortunately. But he also has a different approach. Reiner Knizia is very well regarded, and he has an approach that people know and people love. And this is a Knizia game, feels like a Knizia game through and through. It is an OG, and it's an OG with a really nice presentation. If you're just looking at the gameplay, Pollen is good. Very good, maybe. Not top tier, not great, right? There are a lot of very good games in the world. Do you need Pollen, necessarily? For its gameplay, maybe not. But for its combination of light, approachable, yet thinky, that classic OG style gameplay, but with a very modern, pretty presentation that can attract casual gamers, more so than this, which is a very, very bland presentation. You should check out my side-by-side comparison. I'll link to it here if you haven't seen it, because the presentation of this blows this one out of the water. Don't bother with Samurai the card game. Not only is the presentation much, much more abstract, which doesn't bother me personally, moreover, it takes up much, much, much more table space. If you don't have like a really large table, you might have to play Samurai the card game on the floor. Pollen, they did a good job. They could have done more, but they did a good job of shrinking down that experience a little bit. So it plays on a reasonable table surface, still a bit big. They could have gone smaller, but much better than the old one. So if you're interested in the game, don't look at the old one. Don't look at Samurai the card game. Pollen is the one you want. It's even in a slightly smaller box. The Allplay boxes are really thin. This is not necessarily a game you run out and get. If you're able to play it first, do so. But I would say don't bother even looking at the old one. Just focus on this new one. See if you can get it played. If you really like the way it looks and you're worried about how it plays, because you can evaluate a game based on how it looks without buying it. But evaluating how it plays needs a play, or at least research, watching YouTube videos and getting opinions from people like me. So if you love the way it looks and you think the gameplay is good, I like Knizia, then yeah, Pollen is worth a look at. Allplay did a great job with the presentation, the little meeples with the butterflies and that look great. The artwork from Beth Sobel is great. And the gameplay is as good as a standard Knizia. Not one of his top tier games, but it definitely meets that minimum threshold of goodness, such that if presentation is the most important thing to you and you just want somebody to say, hey, the gameplay is good, just decide if you want this based on how it looks and just trust that the gameplay is good, okay, I'll give you that confidence. The gameplay is good. Now, if you like how it looks, seek it out. Thanks for watching. Games like Samurai the card game and Pollen don't stop being good just because there are newer games that come out. Take care.